Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Washington Times Foundation program entitled The Washington Brief, the monthly forum of experts assessing risks and opportunities in the Korean Peninsula. Today, we have distinguished experts on this issue. First, it's Ambassador Christopher Hill, professor of the School of International Public Affairs at Columbia University and U.S. Ambassador to 4 nations, including Korea in 2004 to 2005. We also have with us Ambassador Joseph DeTrani, Board of Managers, Sandia National Laboratories, and former U.S. envoy to the six-party talks. Dr. Alexandre Mansourov, professor of the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University, and Mr. Guy Taylor, who's the National Security Team Leader for the Washington Times. As our diplomacy with Pyongyang proceeds in fits and starts, the international community faces many risks and opportunities in the pursuit of the peaceful resolution of numerous hot button issues with the DPRK and deeply entrenched inter-Korean conflict. Our experts today will be discussing and looking at these opportunities and challenges, and we will be hosted by Ambassador Christopher Hill, who will be the moderator for our program. This is the beginning of a monthly program that will be on every first Tuesday of the month. Welcome to the Washington Brief. At this time, we welcome the moderator for our program, Ambassador Christopher Hill. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much, Michael. Let me say what a pleasure it is to be in this program and to have the opportunity with some real time to discuss these very serious and difficult issues. So, of course, today's topic is that hardy perennial of international security problems, that is North Korea and its continued appetite for nuclear weapons. So I think we have a really excellent panel to discuss this. And I think this is a particularly good time to discuss it because we have still another administration, this time the Biden administration, which has come forward after a policy review to kind of lay out some of the parameters within which it's going to be following and hopefully trying to solve this issue. North Korea's nuclear ambitions didn't just start yesterday. They've been kind of at them really since the 1960s through the 1970s, 80s, 90s. During the early part of this new century when I was directly involved in it, and then through the right up to until today. It has been a really tough issue to deal with. And so I guess the question will be whether we've got, whether this will be a triumph of hope over experience and whether we can kind of go after this issue, our country can go after this issue again, and this time make some progress. To be sure, the previous administration under President Trump had its own very special way of going after this, and that was to kind of start and end with symmetry. That is, getting the two leaders together and hopefully getting them to reach an agreement. They met in Singapore. They then met in Hanoi. They actually met on the Korean demilitarized zone where President Trump actually walked into North Korea. Unfortunately, none of these 3 meetings was really enough to change the situation and to convince North Korea that it's really time to settle. And instead, we have it right there in the lap of the new administration. The new administration took some time to really study the issue, to look at past efforts. Certainly, different administrations have had different approaches. Before the Trump administration's kind of symmetry approach, there was President Obama's approach, which was a kind of effort to show some patience, what was called strategic patience. And then before the Obama administration, of course, there was the George W. Bush administration, which was to pursue this through a very formal process of multilateralism known as the six-party talks. Previous to that, there was President Clinton's efforts, which was more sort of on a bilateral basis, although there was a lot of multilateralism in that approach. So now President Biden's team has come forward with an approach, It suggests that they're not going to pursue this kind of symmetry that that President Trump pursued, but nor are they going to pursue this this kind of benign neglect, this idea of strategic patience, which is what was done during the Obama administration. So it's going to be something different. I think they have, the senior officials of the administration has made very clear that they're going to be discussing this issue or dealing with this issue through several layers. And one of them, of course, is going to be diplomacy. I think they've also made very clear that they're not going to allow the North Koreans to kind of sit on the sidelines and get relief from the U.S. in order to join a negotiation. It's going to be up to the North Koreans to figure out that there is something in this for them, and they ought to come to the table and they ought to look for various things that could come their way in the context of their giving up some things, starting with obviously their nuclear program. So they need to understand that what they're going to be given in this process, or what they're going to be able to negotiate in this process, is not to get things in return for which they will come to the talks, but rather come to the talks and try to negotiate for things that are on the table. I think the Biden administration has come in with a very flexible notion of how to proceed. They've also not gotten involved necessarily in the whole issue at this point of what are the format of the talks. You know, and often in diplomacy, one worries about format before one worries about form. I think the Biden administration has made pretty clear that they're interested in the other substance of this, and whatever format could support a resolution of these substantive differences is a format they will go after. But for now, it's simply to make North Korea understand this is a major issue for the Biden administration, and it seeks really to have a negotiation process, but a negotiation process that will be in the context of some other things, including safeguarding U.S. and the security interests not only of the U.S. but also of its alliances. So a number of points they want to pursue simultaneously. North Koreans have responded with a display of their customary charm, essentially saying they don't want to have anything to do with it. Very rough statement, not unusual for them, and in some respects rather retro. I mean, we've seen this before in the various acts of this sort of long-running play. So it's not clear that North Korea is ready. But nor do I believe that we should accept their statement that to the effect that they are not at all happy with this policy review. We should not accept that statement as the final statement from the North Koreans. So a great deal of diplomacy to follow. There will be a lot of effort in this regard, and I think so this is a good time to bring some people together who know this subject very much like the back of their hands, and see what ideas we can pursue. So I'd like to start perhaps with Joe DeTrani. Ambassador DeTrani has a lot of experience in this issue. He's been doing a lot of different things on this over the years, and I have had the privilege really to work very directly with him on the six-party talks in Beijing as we try to address this. So, Joe, pleasure to see you again, and let me start by hearing what are your views on how this is likely to play out. And I guess the central question is, do you believe there's a deal to be made? Will North Korea at some point, with some measure of compensation of some kind, ever be willing to give up those nuclear programs that it has started and pursued in the defiance of just about everybody?
Thank you, Chris. It's an honor being here and meeting with you and our distinguished panelists and all of those who are watching this session. It's a timely session. I think what you captured initially with your comments is right on the mark. Let me just say, you mentioned a number of years having worked this issue. Yes, 13 of the last 17 years. a number of meetings with senior officials from the North Korea. It's had a significant impression on me, so I have a few takeaways from those encounters. And one of them is that North Korea wants a normal relationship with the United States. This is something, I'm going to go back to Kim Il-sung and Billy Graham, Dr. Billy Graham in 1994, but this is something that North Korea wants. However, they want it on their terms. They're talking about accepting them as a nuclear weapon state. And we've consistently made it clear, certainly during your period of heading the six-party talks, that the US would not accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state because of proliferation issues. Other states will seek nuclear weapons. We would possibly be seeing, or likely be seeing, a nuclear arms race in the region. The possibility of proliferation of nuclear weapons or fissile material to terrorist organizations, rogue states, et cetera. So I think that's important. But the key takeaway for me is North Korea wants a normal relationship with the United States. That is why they see the US as their principal interlocutor. And that's important. But some of the other takeaways are North Korea has made it very clear they're not a Libya. They've seen what's happened to Gaddafi. They're not Iraq, and they've seen what's happened to Saddam Hussein. So when we talk about following the Libyan model, when we talk about North Korea needs to denuclearize initially before we could talk about, if you will, deliverables to meet their demands, it's unrealistic. And we've seen this for 27 years of failed negotiations. So I think that's an important element there. North Korea is looking for what we had in the six-party talks, actions for actions, commitments for commitments. And I do believe North Korea is committed to complete verifiable denuclearization, assuming they get the security assurances they need, they want, and certainly they need, because they're concerned about regime change. And they realize nuclear weapons indeed are, a deterrent. When you look at that reality, it's a fact. And they feel having nuclear weapons will prevent anyone from imposing themselves on North Korea. So what we have to do is, and we did that in the six-party talks, and you were intimate with that with your leadership, Chris, is give them the security assurances. And we did that in the six-party talks with the joint statement of September 2005, with negative security assurances, a process that will lend itself to normal relations. If you will, a peace treaty, finally ending the Korean War, economic development assistance, et cetera. These are some of the deliverables they're looking at. But in return, they need to start moving with dismantlement of all their nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons facilities. So there's no question about that. And you mentioned strategic patience. You mentioned the Obama administration. Strategic patience for North Korea, and we saw that clearly, was an opportunity for them to build more nuclear weapons and missile delivery systems. So what did we accomplish by that? And that's why I think when Secretary Blinken is talking about diplomacy being in the lead, he's talking about we want to engage with North Korea. We want to be meeting with North Korea. We wanted to be hearing their concerns. They need to hear what's required of them when we talk about comprehensive, verifiable denuclearization. And they need to be hearing from us, but also we need to be hearing from them when they talk about security assurances, economic development assistance. And let me just say, China is a critical player in this regard. And we saw this in the six-party talks when they hosted, at the request of then Secretary of State Colin Powell, they hosted the six-party process. China has a peace and friendship treaty. They're an ally of North Korea. Over 90% of the trade is with China, and over 90% of the fuel, the crude oil, the petroleum products are from China. So China needs to be at the table. And I do believe China is committed to what we are, complete, verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And we're talking about North Korea. There are no nuclear weapons in South Korea. So I will say this, though, for the Trump administration, I thought the Singapore joint statement was a very, very effective, a very succinct, but very effective document that spoke of a transformation of our relationship, which is what North Korea wants, a process to normalize relations with the US, initially a liaison office, eventually, if you will, embassies in our respective capitals. And that's when all issues are put on the table, not only denuclearization, but we're also talking about human rights issues, progress on human rights, transparency into those issues, cease and desist from illicit activities, also extremely, very, very important. So they talked about in the Singapore Joint Statement, a transformation of a relationship that North Korea wants with the United States. And this will lend itself to peace in the region, eventually a peace treaty, but also complete verifiable denuclearization and the return of those American troops who were lost in the Korean War. I think that's the basis. We have a document now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a document now to be working with that was negotiated by our former president, Donald Trump, with Chairman Kim Jong-un. And I think if indeed any of us were back in negotiating with North Korea, this is on the table. Now let's move from that. So I think we have the makings to move forward. And I heard what you said, Chris, up front when some of the statements from the North Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs over the weekend, when they spoke about a hostile policy on the part of the US. We've heard that before. We've heard that many times. We shouldn't discount it, but look, let's just put it aside and move forward and get meetings going and talk about the substance of it. Because once we start meeting, as we did in the six-party process, we could start building the trust. And trust is going to be very critical if we want an eventual solution, which I believe is attainable. If we have patience and we have an action for action commitment policy towards complete verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula in return for security assurances, a peace treaty, economic development assistance, and eventually a normal relationship.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Joe. I'm taking that as a kind of optimistic view that somehow if we put enough on the table, the North Koreans will understand that they should accept what's on the table and do the things that we want to see them do, that is give up their nuclear weapons. I guess what worries me about it is we put it on the table and they didn't seem to pick it up in the context of getting rid of their nuclear weapons. Secondly, and I'm not here to criticize anyone who came before because I'm one of them, but I'm not sure we took a lot out of Singapore in terms of kind of getting stuff going forward. And so one of the reasons we're having this conference right now is to sort of look forward and see what else, how else we can pursue this. And I think it'll be a real opportunity to see, to hear Professor Alex Mansourov's comments on the issue of other countries' participation. Now, I used to have this desultory almost dialogue of the deaf with the Chinese, where I would say, look, we can't solve it, you need to solve it. And the Chinese would say, we can't solve it, you need to solve it. And of course, we were trying to lead to the notion that both of us are necessary. So I do believe that this is a problem that goes beyond the capacity of any one country to solve. And so, but I do kind of lean to the view that those countries that have been more closely involved in North Korea's formative years, let's put it that way, have some special, I would say, responsibility, but perhaps special insights to how they could resolve it. And I'm going to turn to Alex, who certainly knows the equation from several sides, including the fact that he's a fluent Korean speaker and has dealt for many times with the North Koreans themselves. He also knows the Chinese, but he also is very much knows where the Russians are on this. And I guess one question I have is, you know, we have so many problems with China. It's not at all clear how we can cooperate with them. We also have enormous number of problems with the Russians. It's not clear how we can cooperate with them either. But could North Korea pose a possibility as one of those places where we can achieve some patterns of cooperation with those countries that are obviously not allies, but they've certainly been partners in this process in the past? So, Alex?
Yes, thank you, Chris, for your very kind introduction, and thanks to the Washington Times for the invitation. It's really a high honor for me to be part of this very distinguished panel, together with Ambassador Hill, Ambassador DeTrani, and Guy Taylor. Now, let me begin by saying, by asking a question: where do we stand now? Obviously, the North Korea policy review is over. As we are told, the Biden administration decided to chart its own course by pursuing neither President Trump's grand bargain with North Korea, nor pushing for President Obama's strategic patience line vis-a-vis Pyongyang. In contrast, this president seems to want to give a chance to diplomacy by planning to pursue a quote-unquote calibrated and practical approach based on the action for action principle towards the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, while maintaining quote-unquote stern deterrence posture on the peninsula. Now, it's easy to dismiss this proposed policy as same old, as old wine in new bottles, as reinventing the bicycle. I mean, it's easy to criticize it as unimaginative, as quote-unquote small thinking or presumptuous. And yet, in my opinion, the big question is whether North Korea will basically engage the Biden administration. And if it doesn't, then what then? Now, as we know, it takes two to tango. And what if the North Korean bride does not come to dance at the ceremony? Now, I agree completely with Ambassador Hill that we must distinguish between initial reaction and the real actions. Initially, of course, in public statements, the North Koreans accused Washington of committing a quote-unquote serious blunder, and they threatened a very grave situation or the worst crisis beyond our control. But that's rhetoric. In reality, we need to watch for what they will actually do to gauge their real intentions. And so far, I'm reassured that they have not burned any bridges yet. Now, from a tactical standpoint, in my opinion, North Koreans are likely to test how seriously the United States is really committed to diplomacy, because they've seen this game many times before. They played this game with us many times before. And so, in my opinion, they may actually launch, I don't know, maybe a satellite or conduct a submarine-based ICBM test sometime around May 21st, the Biden-Moon summit, just to see whether the Biden administration will abandon diplomacy after encountering the first headwinds. Just like the Obama administration did in April 2012 by jettisoning the Leap Day agreement after the North Korean satellite launch of the time. Now, that's number one. So they're likely to test the seriousness of our commitment to diplomacy. Number two, I think in tactical terms, there's certain to play, quote unquote, hard to get, as they always do. I mean, Ambassador Hill knows it well, Ambassador DeTrani knows it well. So they're likely to try to extract a very high price from the US just for returning to the negotiation table. And they may ask for sanctions relief first before they even show up. There is no question about it in my mind. Now, despite the Western assumption that the North Korean regime is in dire straits because of the sanctions, because of the pandemic, because of the border closures, but in my opinion, Kim Jong-un feels very confident and very secure at home. And so he's in no rush to re-engage with the United States. And he is likely to stall for time to see where South Korea is going to come down in the wake of the next presidential election in the South in March 2022, before they really make any move. Now, from a strategic perspective, I think Kim Jong-un knows very well that American objectives are incompatible with North Korean objectives. I mean, he knows that it was said publicly by our national security advisor, by the Secretary of State, that the United States wants to strengthen the security of the United States, of its allies and deployed forces, not the security of North Korea, or collective security. And so obviously North Koreans do not share that objective. I mean, secondly, the United States wants to break up the North Korean-Chinese alliance and further weaken the North Korean state by disarming it and depriving it of its resources. So in Kim's mind, why should North Korea play ball and go along with the United States and its efforts to disarm and weaken the North Korean state and its alliance system, especially at the time when the US-Chinese confrontation is escalating, and when Beijing, sent a lot of signals to Pyongyang, basically saying, look, we're going to try to boost the alliance to strengthen the Chinese-North Korean alliance, opposing the US-ROC alliance and US efforts to strengthen its own alliance system. So I know some observers, they believe that Kim Jong-un will actually try to explore what the United States is willing to offer that China cannot offer to him in terms of sanctions relief, security assurances, and international recognition in the context and as a result of the normalization of bilateral relations between the United States and North Korea to be debated. I believe this is wishful thinking. I don't believe Kim Jong-il will risk his country's security and his alliance with China on a whim and a prayer, especially given the lessons he learned by looking at Iraq, by looking at Libya, by looking at JCPOA, as well as his experience negotiating with the Trump administration. So I think Kim Jong-un is not going to negotiate away his nuclear weapons. They're not the bargaining chips for him. He is not going to trade off nuclear weapons for material benefits. If anything, he will aim in whatever negotiations with us to normalize North Korea's status as the nuclear weapons state, as well as to clean up the international repercussions of North Korea's nuclear breakout by trying to get rid of sanctions, lift the blockade, and lift various trade bans. So in conclusion, when you asked the question whether the denuclearization of North Korea, whether it's a lost cause, doomed to failure even before we began our negotiations with the North, we don't really know until we try all policy options, including the Biden administration's proposed so-called new diplomatic initiative vis-a-vis North Korea. So it remains to be seen, and I'll be happy to entertain your question about the role of our powers during the Q&A session. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Alex. You've given a lot of food for thought there. Not all of it very tasty, but we will nonetheless, I think, get into all of that. Before we do, though, I'd like to now turn to Guy Taylor from the Washington Times, who spent, I don't know what it is, Guy, maybe half a lifetime following these North Korean issues and the efforts by the various administrations. I think I went through it in my opening. About every administration has had a North Korea policy. And so maybe we could ask you to talk a little about where we are with the current policy and where we're likely to get.
Yep. Thanks, Ambassador Hill. Thank you very much to the Washington Times Foundation, Ambassador DeTrani, Alex Mansourov, Michael Jenkins. I'm really flattered to participate in this discussion at this important moment in the midst of really what I think we can all agree is a kind of gray area transition period with regard to US policy toward the North Korean nuclear crisis. I think the US, South Korean, and North Korean strategic communities are all still grappling with what comes next after what was a moment of really unprecedented top-down diplomatic developments of the Trump era. And this transition we're in is now very much being defined by the as yet unknown direction that the Biden administration intends to take things, and really the even less certain landscape of possibilities with regard to what Kim Jong-un, who's now 37 years old, may seek to do, or provocations that his regime may try to engage in. Submarine launched ballistic missile tests are an expectation, or potentially a seventh nuclear test, really at any time here to disrupt or try to shape this current transition period. How would the Biden administration respond to that? Do we have a clear answer to that question right now? And the reason I bring up Kim Jong-un's age is because at the end of the day, this crisis is about people. And Chairman Kim is perhaps the most important person involved at this point. And I think it's worth considering the mindset of the young North Korean leader. He's not so young anymore, actually. He's now got the very vital experience of the past several years, where essentially he stared down the barrel of what, for a chunk of months between late 2017 and early 2019, was a very focused US, South Korean, Trump era effort to alter the paradigm, to change things, basically to try to get this new generation North Korean leader to engage in a denuclearization deal that had seemed inconceivable at the end of his father's reign a decade ago. There was a window, particularly in early 2019, and I know this because I was there on the ground in Hanoi, and I felt it along with just about everybody else who was there, when it seemed like things might really change. So Kim Jong-un has that experience now, and I think it'd be wise for us all who are trying to engage in a kind of Kremlinology with regard to the machinations of the Kim regime, or to try and guess basically what Kim Jong-un might be thinking right now about Joe Biden, or about denuclearization, or about his relationship with Xi Jinping or Moon Jae-in, or really about anything for that matter. I think we should take into consideration that Kim may, despite how bad things might look for the North Korean economy at the moment in the COVID era, he may feel pretty confident that he won the last round, and that the Americans eased back to regroup, or were disrupted by US democratic politics and election cycles, as it were, while his regime continued to clandestinely build nuclear weapons in violation of decades of UN Security Council resolutions, and also continued advancing its ballistic missile capabilities, with a particular eye, if we read the latest declassified analysis put out by the Congressional Research Service a week or so ago, with a particular eye toward gaining the capability to circumvent the latest US missile defense shields on the Korean Peninsula. I'm talking about THAAD, but also around the region. So that's sort of the stage right now as I see it, from my perspective as a daily journalist covering this, basically trying to keep the tip of the spear in view. Really what's happening right now, what's likely about to happen, who are the players right now. What I can tell you is that the North Korea file has taken a back burner spot for the Biden administration, which has so far been much more focused on Iran, Afghanistan, Russia, COVID-19. President Biden has filled a few key National Security Council positions on North Korea, but the special envoy positions for North Korea, North Korean human rights issues, they remain unfilled. Biden has yet to nominate an ambassador to South Korea. We also don't yet have a nominee for a replacement for General Robert Abrams, who many thought would be rotating out as commander of U.S. Forces Korea by now. So there are some unknowns here on the personnel front for the American side, and I don't think that precludes the establishment of a deep policy team quickly coming together, or a deep policy review, which the administration is undertaking. But I do think it's symbolic. It shows that the North Korea crisis for Joe Biden's first 100 days is essentially what I would describe as a kind of new frozen status quo. I'd like to conclude there. Hopefully we can maybe dive a little more deeply into the Biden administration's policy review during the Q&A session here. And thank you very much for having me.
Thanks very much, Guy. And I'd like to get back to Joe DeTrani's very optimistic view that if we just kind of lay out our willingness to have a normal relationship with North Korea, relationship that we have with many other countries, that somehow North Korea will see the value of giving up its nuclear weapons. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, Joe, but do you really think that there are some things that we can do to bring them along? Because I seem to remember the 2005 joint statement was pretty good in terms of welcoming cross-recognition, sanctions relief, energy support, economic support. As you said, no hostile intent, no intent to ever invade or harm North Korea. I thought we kind of laid it all out, and we didn't get really much back from the North Koreans. They were engaged in a negotiation with us. And ultimately, when we came to the issue of how to verify their program, they seemed to insist on a sort of North Korean exceptionalism, whereas every other country had gone to certain rules that have been set up over the years. The North Koreans said, no, we're different. We're North Koreans. So go ahead, give me reasons to be more optimistic.
Well, I think you captured a lot of it, Chris. Look, I would not debate the point on verification. Indeed, in latter part of 2008, 2009, that was an issue where North Korea was reluctant to permit monitors to leave declared sites to visit suspect nuclear sites. So I think that spoke to a bigger issue for North Korea. And we saw that with the agreed framework in 1994, their highly enriched uranium program, the need to have a security assurance, and that was nuclear weapons. So, indeed, if we didn't come up with the highly enriched uranium program, discovering that they were pursuing it in 2001, 2002, we may now have had a normal relationship with North Korea. But this is their desire. They want it both ways, Chris. They want a normal relationship, but they want the nuclear weapons, and they cite Pakistan often. You have accepted Pakistan as a nuclear weapon. You could trust us. We would never use it. We would be responsible, etc. So this is their desire. This is what they want. It then becomes our responsibility, our, if you will, burden to convince them that, one, we will not cave on that. Because I personally think, further to Alexandre's point, I think they feel if they persist with that, eventually they will get the United States and others to accept them as a nuclear weapon state, and they will be treated the same way Pakistan eventually.
Well, I'm not going to defend the Pakistan nuclear program, but it's pretty clear it's kind of tied to the Indian nuclear program.
Exactly. And with North Korea. With North Korea, they see it as, they see the U.S. presence in South Korea. They see the U.S. presence in the Indo-Pacific region, and they remember the Korean War as we do very vividly. Yeah. So I guess what I'm saying is they will do whatever they can to be accepted as a nuclear weapon state. But I think what trumps that is they want a normal relationship with the United States, and if we could close that gap. If we could, as we were doing in the six-party talks, if we could give them the security assurances, and the best security assurances, and we did that, you did that, we all did that, is a process to normalize relations with embassies in our respective capitals. Listen, President Clinton was almost there in 2000 with the Secretary of State Albright's visit and Marshall Joe's visit to the White House meeting with President Clinton. We were almost there in 2000. So I think the point I'm trying to make is this: if we can convince them, and we were almost there in 2000, I think we were almost there even with the six-party process. And I think with the Singapore joint statement, I think that's further indicative of the fact that this man, a young man, but he's been in power for 10 years, a young man wants to continue with what his father and grandfather were pursuing, is a normal relationship with the US. I don't think they just want to be tethered to China. I don't think they want to be tethered to any particular country. I think they see a relationship with the United States as opening them up to the world, foreign direct investment, they become legitimized, etc. Some people will argue that that would be a threat to Kim Jong-un. Well, then you can't win with that argument. I believe he's beyond that. I don't think he would have gone to Singapore if he wasn't beyond that. I think he's ready to do that, assuming we stay the course and we make it clear we're not going to cave in on the nuclear issue. We're not going to accept them as a nuclear weapon state, but we are prepared to move further to the Singapore joint statement with the normal relationship with North Korea, with all the other benefits that will accrue. But your point, Chris, verifiable denuclearization of all nuclear weapons and weapons facilities, but also to include what they're doing with illicit, what they're doing with cyber, what they're doing on human rights issues. I mean, there's a myriad of issues out there that need to be addressed. And unless they're addressed, Chris, and you know this so well, being the ambassador in South Korea, we will not see security on the peninsula. We will not see security in the region. North Korea retaining nuclear weapons, we could put as many sanctions as we want on the table and so forth, and we could be a lot of pressure. As long as North Korea persists with what they're doing with possibly another nuclear test, missile delivery systems, further illicit activities, cyber crime and so forth, it will lend itself to instability in the region. And I don't think that's where we want to be.
You know, Joe, I can't recall if you were in the room when I asked the North Korean negotiator what the purpose of their nuclear program was. And he told me deterrence. So I said to Kim, I said, terrific. Now, could you explain to me how that would work, deterrence? Let's say the US attacked you, then what would happen? And it was, to put it mildly, a rather theoretical discussion, and it didn't get very far. But my sense is it's not deterrence. My sense is that they would like to create the circumstance where, if not this president or even the next president or even the president after that, but at some point, they create the circumstance where a US president says, you know, that's a dangerous place there, and I'm not sure we want US troops in the middle of it. So maybe we can say to the North Koreans, hey, if we pull out our troops, would you pull out, get rid of your nuclear weapons? I don't find that a particularly tolerable trade-off, especially because I think our alliance with South Korea is now much more than just the mutual protection against North Korea. But I have the impression that that's where the North Koreans would like to go, that is to use nuclear weapons to, in effect, scare a future US president off of the Korean Peninsula. And with that, I'd like to ask Alex.
But can I get back to you, Chris, Chris, on just one point, Chris, on the
Yeah.
point of deterrence. Chris,
Yeah.
I do believe if they feel they have nuclear weapons and delivery systems, now an ICBM capability with the Warsaw 14 and 15,
Yeah.
I think their rationale is the US would not strike them, concerned that they would respond in kind. So I think they do see nuclear weapons as a deterrent for anything that's inimical to their interests, like regime change or what have you.
Yeah.
I do believe that's how they see it.
Okay. Alex, if you could maybe speak to some of these issues and also to the broader issue of can the U.S. really do this alone, or does it need some fellow travelers on this road? Namely, is China going to be essential to this? Joe made the point that they don't want to be a vassal state to China. And so if not a vassal state to China, would they mind being a vassal state to Russia? So where does the participation of these other countries fit into any policy aimed at North Korea?
Chris, this is an excellent question. We live in a new era, the era of great powers rivalry, whether we like it or not. And that's the new reality. And in this new reality, I think any cooperation with other great power neighbors of North Korea, especially China and Russia, will be extremely difficult. Now, as the US-Chinese confrontation is escalating, I think China will do everything in its power to protect its core national interests in the so-called first, second, and third rings of its security: homeland defense, buffer zone defense, and regional security. And so North Korea is the sole military ally in that critical region dominated by the US and its allies. It's a strategic buffer to be maintained. And so I think China is basically not going to allow North Korea to fail. And not only it will do as much as necessary to prevent North Korea's collapse, but basically it'll do everything it can to rebuild the strategic buffer in North Korea. What does it mean for our negotiations, nuclear negotiations? I think that the aggravating US-Chinese strategic competition will definitely negatively impact the nuclear talks. I don't think China is going to vote for any more anti-North Korean Security Council resolutions. I think they're likely to slacken off cooperation on international sanctions, looking the other way, or helping actually North Korea to dismantle the existing sanctions regimes. I mean, we know China is complicit in North Korean sanctions evasion efforts already. It turns the blind eye to the ship-to-ship transfers of petroleum products and coal, which again often involve Chinese ships and take place in Chinese waters. And although, yes, North Korea might try to drive a wedge between Beijing and Washington in these talks, but that's, in my opinion, a very high-risk strategy for Pyongyang, and they're not likely to follow it. Now, if you look at Russia, which also has a very difficult relationship with the United States these days, the question in my mind is really who cares and why not in Moscow about North Korea? North Korea is truly peripheral and far away. Nobody in the Kremlin or inside the so-called garden ring cares about North Korea. It's really neither Ukraine nor Syria as far as the Russian policymakers are concerned. Again, Northeast Asia is not really like the post-Soviet space or the Middle East in the grand Russian national security strategy. And so as far as the Kremlin, North Korea is part of China's sphere of influence, and it's really China's problem, not Russian problem. Yes, Putin might view North Korea, President Putin, as a valuable pawn in his possible bargaining with the Biden administration, just like he approached this issue during the Trump years. And so Russian cooperation with the United States in Korea, on the peninsula, they hope in Moscow might help them put the bottom in the sinking US-Russian relationship, and might even kind of help reset that relationship. But that's really a high aspiration. Yeah. Now, they do criticize American sanctions against North Korea, but in my opinion, it's really more about Russia itself than about North Korea. When Moscow says that sanctions are wrong and they do not work, really it sends two messages to the United States. The first is that the US sanctions against Russia are wrong and they do not work. And the second is that the US policy is wrong-headed and it will not work, as always. And so, again, nevertheless, Moscow supports sanctions because of its determination to convince the United States that Russia is different from North Korea, that Russia is not a rogue state, that Russia can work with the United States on the North Korean issue, and hence the US should abandon its anti-Russian stance. Yeah. Whether it will work or not, I doubt. So if there is any plan to outsource our policy on the peninsula to either China or Russia, I think these are wrong-headed plans and they will produce no results at all.
Thank you very much. Guy, I'm going to turn to you for this mega diplomatic question. We have, on the one hand, a deteriorating, or I should say deteriorated, US-China relationship, which, by the way, has now spanned two administrations. And the same could be said of the US-Russia relationship for a variety of very obvious reasons. Russia's Russia's cyber attacks, Russia's behavior, especially through our elections, issues like that. And so I think a big question, as Alex suggested, is are we going to be able to recruit China to a revamped North Korea strategy, or recruit Russia, for that matter, to a revamped North Korea strategy? Or are we simply going to have to accept that we're not going to get much there? Now, there is talk that somehow we can work with China on areas of mutual interest, including climate change, for example. And surely we have a mutual interest in keeping, matches away from children, namely keeping North Korea away from nuclear weapons. But I think it's going to be tough. What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I think the short answer to this question of whether or not the US and China can work together on the North Korea file is we don't know. But what we do know is that Kurt Campbell and Antony Blinken and Joe Biden all were in the Obama administration at a time when the core mantra of the US thinking on North Korea was all keys to the castle are in Beijing. You've got to go through the Chinese, whether you do it through diplomacy and niceties, or you do it through some sort of subversive moves like secondary sanctions on Chinese banks that are moving money for the North Korean regime. Some way you get the Chinese to get onto your side in the Kim Jong-un era, not the Kim Jong-il era, and you find this common interest. The problem now is that the entire dynamic has changed as China's economy has begun to surpass that of the US in total GDP size, as the instruments of economic and diplomatic power around the world have expanded for China before our eyes. And our thinking about how China fits into the puzzle, I think risks having become a bit stale at this point. And this is why the Biden administration's policy review right now is so important, that it's not just a let's buy some time, or let's figure out who the best young talent might be to get at the table with the North Koreans. This is really about how can we do some soul searching about America's position in the world at the end of the first quarter of the century, what China's position is going to be. I think Alex was referring to it as a great power competition. And I think Joe was referring to it in terms of trying to read where the North Koreans are in terms of their own view of their giant neighbors right now. So that's kind of the long way of not really of we don't know yet. And I think that's one of the big questions facing the coming couple of years. My prediction is that the Biden administration is going to try to find a way to work with the Chinese. I think at best the Biden administration will come out with some kind of policy pronouncements between now and Moon Jae-in's visit in 3 weeks in Washington on May 21. I think at worst, though, we're going to see surprising events shape the Biden administration's policy. And what I'm talking about is that Kim Jong-un has been relatively quiet. This is back to this sort of what's the tip of the spear right now. Kim has been pretty quiet during this U.S. policy review and transition, but there are signs that that's about to change. Pyongyang's propaganda operation has been really active over the past couple of weeks with videos and reports that appear to be aimed at whipping up popular North Korean enthusiasm over major advances in the country's ballistic missile program. This is kind of new. It's caught the eye of some North Korea watchers. I think it's triggering speculation that the Kim government is preparing a barrage of provocations, tests of some kind. Perhaps the goal would be to try and cut the legs out from whatever strategy or policy move the Biden White House finally announces. And I can't emphasize the Moon Jae-in visit. This will be the first visit by the South Korean president to the new administration. I think we'll see the Biden administration's policy very much in the news, and I think you'll see people calling it something like strategic patience 2.0 or strategic patience 2.5 or something like that. That's essentially going to, the U.S. wants to continue to isolate Pyongyang through sanctions, taking care not to reward the Kim regime. But I think the big question is what kind of back channel can be opened with the North Koreans right now. Right now, there isn't a back channel. Anybody working on the file at the end of the last U.S. administration and through the start of this one will tell you, and Biden's people have admitted this, that there's no back channel. The South Koreans will tell you this as well. And I know that the more esteemed panelists here have discussions with the South Koreans about this. There isn't a back channel. So I think there's this sense that Moon Jae-in is going to try to push or is pushing the Biden administration to tolerate some leeway for South Korea to kind of get around the periphery of U.S. sanctions, engage in outreach with the North Koreans, perhaps even with some aid-based or economic incentives to try to convince Pyongyang to join in bilateral talks with the South Koreans. Remember those talks, the Pyongyang declaration, all this stuff that happened on the sideline of Trump's summitry. The North and South were having unprecedented bilateral talks for a couple of years there, 2017 to 2019. Will the Biden administration tolerate something like that from the South Koreans? I would say probably. And could it lead to the reopening of a back channel through South Korea to Pyongyang? Perhaps. That might be wishful thinking because the Moon administration in Seoul is going to be gone in basically a year. No one knows yet, including Kim Jong-un, what government will take power in Seoul. So, my sense is the North Koreans are unlikely to play fast and loose right now with back channels with the Moon government. But those are a few thoughts. There's a lot of moving parts to this. But short answer is we don't know. We don't know how heavily China is going to factor into Biden's policy yet.
All right. I think we're down to, we're probably in overtime right now. But Joe, real quick, does time favor the North Koreans? Alex thinks they're doing quite okay. A lot of people would take issue with that. So do you think time favors them in terms of staying away from talks, or do you think they need the talks to get something going?
I think it's in North Korea's interest, Chris, to come to the table.
Yeah.
I think it's in their interest to come to the table. They may see the tension between the U.S. and China as something that plays to their advantage, but that could be short-lived. So I think it behooves, I think, the leadership in Pyongyang to come to the table and see where the Biden administration is and see if they could move forward. Further too, and I keep citing the Singapore joint statement because I think that is a basis to work with. I mean, this is a former president who consummated this agreement with with Chairman Kim Jong-un. So yeah, it's in their interest to come to the table, Chris, and it's in our interest also to not to pay them to come to the table.
Yeah.
It should not be conditional, it should be unconditional, but to convince them that it's in their interest, we're prepared to talk about everything and to include what their needs are if they come to the table.
Alex, does that sound right to you? Alex, does that sound right to you that they would they have an interest in coming to the table and we have an interest in not paying them to come to the table?
I disagree. I don't think they're more interested than us in returning to the table, because the question in their mind is, what can the United States offer to them that the Chinese cannot? What China, as Guy suggested, is growing fast and big, real big. For North Korean problems for the Chinese is just a drop in the bucket. I mean, they can solve them, anytime if they want. So I think, they're aware of that reality and they're bidding for time. I mean, they're not in a rush to return.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think it's been a great discussion, and I'm going to turn to the president of the Washington Times Foundation, Michael Jenkins, for some final thoughts and maybe for a look ahead on what we do in subsequent meetings. Michael, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Hill, for a wonderful discussion and a very relevant insights into the situation with North Korea. Our panelists today, Ambassador DeTrani, Dr. Mansourov, and Guy Taylor, are truly experts and have been engaged and continue to be engaged along with Ambassador Hill directly on the Washington side and internationally in helping this dialogue go forward. I do want to mention that the Washington Times Foundation collaborates with the Universal Peace Federation and is continuing to develop fact finders to Korea with experts to better understand our relationship between the US, ROK, and how we might strengthen our alliances there, including Japan. We're very grateful for this opportunity to share this Washington brief with you. We'll be here every month on the first Tuesday of every month, and we're very honored that Ambassador Hill will be moderating and guiding us, and we'll have different guest speakers along with Ambassador DeTrani and also Dr. Mansourov. Special thanks to Guy Taylor of the Washington Times, and we're very happy that we could have this most relevant and timely discussion. The Trump administration, we believe, made some significant progress, and we're hoping the Biden administration will do the same. We believe that it can be addressed, and engagement and dialogue is critically important. So thank you again to all of our audience, and we'll see you the first Tuesday of every month right here. Thank you.